I am so honored to be here, not only in the Woodruff Library, but in the building where, on the 10th floor, so many of Johnson's deeply felt manuscripts, books, and personal effects reside. It is a wonderful place to be. And I would like to bring up Dr. Rudolph Byrd, whose spirit shaped the collection, shaped what you have in Rose Library in ways that are remarkable and continuing. I'd also like to thank the people who brought me here today, Professors Gillespie and Strayhorn, and also Ms. Carter and Ms. Spencer Stevens. I appreciate the work that you do. Oh, am I too quiet? Does that work?
I think so.
Okay. So thank you for having me here today to share my work, and I hope to add to the diverse community of scholars and scholarship that you have here through the James Weldon Johnson Institute. In his real autobiography, Along This Way, published in 1933, some 20-odd years after the autobiography of an ex-colored man, James Weldon Johnson reflected on the presence of African America in the American nation. He wrote, "It seems probable that, instead of developing them independently to the utmost, the Negro will fuse his qualities with those of the other groups in the making of the ultimate American people, and that he will add a tint to America's complexion and put a perceptible permanent wave in America's hair." When Johnson wrote these words, he possessed not only the hindsight of 62 years in America, but a carefully considered knowledge of centuries of New World blacks. His knowledge was familial and represented an expansive geography based on his mother's Bahamian and Haitian heritage and his father's experiences as a free black from Virginia who worked hotels for wintering vacationers in Florida and had family in New York City. His knowledge was personal, based on his experiences with Jim Crow and the geographic, linguistic, and visual diversity of New World black cultures, Cuban itinerant workers in Jacksonville, and boyhood friendships with other young black men, a Cuban exchange student, Ricardo, and the impetuous Judson Douglas Wetmore, who was light enough to pass. Johnson's knowledge was scholarly and multilingual. He had finished his detailed historical and sociological account of a black New York, which broadly extended to world citizenship rights for African Americans in black Manhattan of 1930, just prior to this reflection. And he had translated into English poems by the Cuban Placido, as well as petitions for just treatment made by Haitians under US occupation. Penning his real autobiography Along This Way, Johnson wrote from a hard-earned status, having devoted his life to making sure America dealt with the Negro right and righteously, making this case, excuse me, through his high-profile engagement in many of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's most celebrated causes for racial justice, the silent protest parade marking the racial atrocity of the East St. Louis riots of 1917, the dire anti-lynching bill of 1918 to 22, and the Ocean Sweet case challenging restrictive real estate covenants of 1925 to 6. If the Negro is made to fail, America fails with him, Johnson wrote. Field secretary, and executive secretary in ascending order within the ranks of the NAACP, Johnson deeply shaped this institution's endeavors, correctly viewing racial diplomacy as crucial in a segregated nation's largely ignorant understanding of its African American citizens. Johnson paired his role as a domestic diplomat who constantly invoked a national conscience in matters of Jim Crow segregation and race-targeted brutality, with his prose writings, fiction and nonfiction, on the Negro in America. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man initiated this call to conscience, placing Black culture in multiple geographic, linguistic, and expressive modes that were indicative of the forced diaspora of Black citizens in a global context. Between 1912 and 1935, Johnson authored this anonymously published novel, extensive editorial journalism for major Black and white publications such as the New York Age and The Nation, 2 substantial prefaces to collections of African American poetry and spirituals, a cultural history of Black New York, and an autobiography which originally contained enough material for 2 volumes. Johnson also helped compose print matter that did not include his name, including the publisher's preface to his 1912 The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, anonymous reviews, film scripts, entries Negro American and Negro literature for the Encyclopedia Britannica, and advertisements and flyers gathering support for the dire anti-lynching bill. These prose works augmented Johnson's endeavors in racial diplomacy within as well as outside the nation, including Latin America and Haiti, where he held official roles as American consul to Venezuela and later Nicaragua, and an unofficial one following his resignation from the consulate as NAACP investigator of America's occupation of Haiti. He published 3 volumes of poetry during 1914 to 34 and considered these works artistic contributions to African American equality. The Ex-Colored Man of Johnson's novel is born to a formerly enslaved, fair-skinned woman and her master's son in Reconstruction, Georgia, a few years after the close of the Civil War. Removed to Connecticut when his father marries a well-to-do Southern woman, the narrator attends a grade school that instructs Blacks and whites and discovers his talent and proclivity for musical expression. He is classically trained as a pianist. When he is 9 years old, a shaming event at school reveals the narrator's racial status as a Negro to him. Suddenly, he begins to read on the theory of being a Negro and an American, and on, quote, what my nation thought of me, unquote, through W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. The narrator's early exposure to music through his mother's singing of the spirituals with piano accompaniment provides the counterbalance to his publicly shaming exposure as a Negro in the school classroom. The spirituals form a powerful emotional bond between the narrator and his mother, even before he knows the name and significance of these songs. When he later masters ragtime, which excites the mind and the body, the narrator seems to have found a vehicle for his creativity that also pays well, as he performs in the clubs of Black Bohemia and for hire at leisure class white parties. His signature piece, Felix Mendelssohn's Wedding March, is a hit in both settings. After being party to an unfortunate incident at the club in which a white woman is murdered by her Black lover, the narrator is easily exchanged with his white patron's servant, Walter, and travels with him to Europe as his attendant and for-hire musician. He is asked to play all hours of the night, although he is paid, quote-unquote, liberally for doing so. While in Paris, the narrator attends the opera, Charles Gounod's Faust, and discovers by his side his father and a never-before-seen sister of ethereal and compelling beauty. Distraught and unable to force their acknowledgement of him, he stumbles into the street and seeks oblivion through alcohol. Seeking his life purpose, the narrator is struck by a revelation in Germany where, as he is exhibited by his patron, a German musician forces the narrator from the bench and plays the narrator's ragged classical piece, varied and developed through every known musical form. The narrator decides he will take ragtime and make it classic in much the same way. In pursuit of Black expressive forms, the narrator returns to the American South, attending camp meetings and gathering sermons, spirituals, and work songs. In this setting, he bears witness to the lynching of a black man, an experience that roots him to the spot in horror and mirrors his public shaming in a northern classroom. This event permanently resounds in the narrator's psyche, even as he abandons his pursuit of the dream of becoming a great colored man through varied and developed musical compositions incorporating black expressive culture. Instead, he becomes an ex-colored man. In the North, the narrator courts a seemingly white lover to whom he must tell his secret if he is to marry her. He meets his lover through her voice, which he hears from another room. When he enters and beholds the singer, he is astonished by her dazzlingly white beauty, and more especially by the tone of such passionate color that emanates from her frail body. Together, they write and perform Chopinesque compositions while they are temporarily separated by the trauma of the narrator's revelation. They are also reunited by their dual performance of Chopin's 13th Nocturne. They're married and have 2 children. His wife dies, giving birth to their second child, assuring that the secret of their racial status is kept from the children and continuing the cycle of experience that the narrator himself has endured in the modern soundscape. He is but an observer, not a composer, of the spirituals, as they're given a name and a significance in their performance before him at a Carnegie Hall performance as the novel closes. Johnson never again published a work of fiction like the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, although his unpublished manuscripts contain notes for short stories, operettas, and another novel in which he forces racial inheritance and racial identity into confrontation, showing their misappropriation and reconfiguration based on a changing affiliation with and valuation of Black culture. The author did, however, borrow verbatim from his 1912 work, transferring passages to his preface to the Book of American Negro Poetry of 1922, Black Manhattan of 1930, and even his real autobiography, Along This Way, 1933. While we might argue that Johnson simply found aspects within the 1912 autobiography worthy of repetition, the multiplicity of genres into which he inserted this work, a preface to an anthology, a history, and an autobiography, suggest a deeper, more coherent intent. The author, Johnson, confirmed the dynamic processes of African American cultural practices, inclusive of multiple languages, geographies, and experiences through these repetitions. Reusing passages from the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man underscores how he understood this dynamism, moving through but not contained by a single text, genre, or voice. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man powerfully articulates these multiple registers of nonfiction in a single work. Readers have responded to the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man's provocative ambiguities and its discursive engagements from its initial anonymous publication in 1912 through to the present day, adding ancillary discursive forms, prefaces, introductions, and annotations to Johnson's intervening and ambiguous text. One scholar called it the first pseudo-autobiography in African American literature, and another described it as a landmark in American literary history more generally, describing the novel as an allegory of life across the black-white color line, a quote-unquote mulatto pilgrim's progress. Therefore, the text itself, not just its narrator, draws attention to the accretive and ambiguous practices of an interracial culture and literature in America. The text demands that interpretative practices acknowledge its critical complexities as it continues to be framed and reframed. Different editions of the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man typically reflect one of its 2 most significant and significantly different publication moments, 1912 and 1927. When Johnson first released the novel in 1912 through Sherman French and Company publishers, he chose to publish the work anonymously, reasoning that if the identity of the author were known, the sensation elicited by the novel's conclusion, a man and his children passing into white society, would no longer be provocative and the work would fall flat. The original work's cover had a partially unfurled scroll bearing the title, but with the author's name obscured, which reinforced the author's anonymity, as did the publisher's preface, which discusses the narrative in sociological terms, obscuring the individual author as one of many who have passed over into the white race. Johnson promoted the book as best he could without revealing his authorship, passing it along to white men in the consulate and the American Navy, and arranging for its review by his professor of literature at Columbia, the influential literary authority Brander Matthews. But the Great War devastated the Boston publishing world and Johnson's press. By the time he offered its serial publication to the Chicago Defender in 1919, he had become pretty much careless about protecting his identity as its author. His meeting with Heywood Brown in 1924 and with Carl Van Vechten shortly after helped propel a very different edition of the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, not so much because he substantially revised its content, but because he layered new meanings on the original text. The 1927 edition bears Johnson's name as the author, an introduction by Van Vechten, then the Vanity Fair music columnist and profiler of black artists of the Harlem Renaissance, and an edgy graphic by the new Negro artist Aaron Douglas. A man sits in a diminutive natural landscape on the outskirts of a city, overshadowed by the skyscrapers. British spellings, a vogue of the decade, were adopted, shaping the title to Ex-Colored with the U. The edition itself was part of Alfred A. Knopf's Blue Jade series of fine books, printed in an innovative font and on acid-free paper with the striking orange and black and uncredited design of Douglas's dust jacket wrapping the book. Since the 1912 edition, the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man's inside matter, from the publisher's preface to to Van Vechten's introduction, from American to British spellings and back again, has changed, as has its ancillary material, such as introductions, notes, and biographical and chronological information. Authorities such as Charles S. Johnson, Johnson's contemporary, a sociologist and National Urban League activist, Arne Bontemps, a literary scholar and author, also Johnson's contemporary and his neighbor at Fisk. John Hope Franklin, a historian who studied with Johnson at Fisk, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. more recently, who needs no introduction, have written introductions to the novel that increase its multiple meanings. The introductions and annotations of editions that now span more than a century reflect scholars' continued and incomplete endeavors to capture the narrative's meaning. Some of these editions have become part of the work itself. Its framing in 1965 as one of 3 Negro classics in John Hope Franklin's edited collection of that name has presented the text and Johnson himself as timeless and definitive, creating a tradition of African American letters. Such extensions enrich Johnson's endeavor in writing this work, continuing the author's evolving relationship to his narrator, and this story decades past its 1912 publication. Johnson's efforts to recover, revalue, and make relevant African American culture to the nation at large was part of the wave of modern black cultural identity sweeping the nation. The new Negro had been invoked by authors and speechmakers as various as Booker T. Washington, A. Philip Randolph, and Johnson's brother Rosamond since the late 1890s as the symbol of radical social change in the modern century. The author understood the crucial nature of knowing and valuing a racial past that located one's African and/or New World black ancestors in the contemporary world by acknowledging their creative contributions. Quote, "A civilization is not great until it has produced a great literature, unquote, Johnson wrote in his preface to the Book of American Negro Poetry. Johnson realized it was essential to link that past to a national history because without a nation, African Americans would lack citizenship and remain without a homeland. National discourse, Johnson realized, had to propel forward this usable, even definitive past of Black culture, its literature, art, and history as a distinct voice within a nation. This racial voice could become lost and be shut out from historical greatness, determined by nations, as Johnson observed from his diplomatic post in Venezuela. Of the Negro in Venezuela, Johnson wrote Booker T. Washington, quote, "He will make no name here because he has no obstacle, and I believe that should the same conditions obtain in the United States, he would make no name there." The fusion, quote unquote, of the Negro that Johnson references in the creation of the ultimate American must retain an identifiable, defining, and crucial component that is African American. The Negro past becomes, in Johnson's writings, anticipations of the future, a future that does more than simply accommodate or conjoin African American culture to an American majority. Rather, Johnson's anticipated future makes African Americanness a perceptible, distinctive quality central to American culture, society, and political life. Johnson, who thought of the autobiography of an ex-colored man as a living, moving work, in his phrasing, a biography of the race. This is a phrase that he uses, proposes to use for the preface to his work when he's corresponding with Sherman French and Company, but that phrase gets left out. A biography of the race no doubt would have much to add to his novel, as he viewed more than a century of African American experiences following its publication. The novel has proven prescient in the way it has anticipated this ongoing story of African American life. This story, still unfolding in our 21st century, is central to everything the United States as a nation stands for. As Ralph Ellison reminds us in his essay, 20th Century Fiction and the Black Mask of Humanity, it is important that, quote, "we view the whole of American life as a drama acted upon the body of a Negro giant who, lying trussed up like Gulliver, forms the stage and scene upon which and within which the action unfolds," unquote. In reading the autobiography today, we could not possibly ignore Ellison's notion of the centrality of race to every aspect of American life. While the autobiography explores binaries of social class as well as the creative tensions between ragtime and European classical music, it is also a story about the practices and categories shaping literary study, nationally bounded formations of canon and tradition, transnational crossings and affiliations, and the place of literature and literary study in the world. The anonymous edition of the autobiography, published in 1912, initiated these questions of interpretative practice and literary category, emphasizing and provoking such encounters between reader and text. Reviews from 1912 demonstrate telling preoccupation with identifying the work as fact or fiction. The New York Times described it as a startling tale. It bears some evidences of the truth and may be merely the product of some whimsical imagination, unquote. The Springfield Union finds that, quote, "it reads more like fiction than fact, yet there is a semblance of truth in it. The main elements may be true, but they are embellished as the African is prone to embellish anything in which he is a participant," unquote. The Nashville Tennessean remarks, quote, "an ex-colored man will strike the reader as somewhat of a chimera, for we down here hold that there is no such thing. Once a Negro, always a Negro. The volume was evidently written for Northern consumption," unquote. The New Orleans Picayune responded to its interesting comments, quote unquote, of the race problem, especially its, quote, significant warnings against the dangers of race amalgamation. The outcome of the writer's change of race is not pleasing, yet it is suggestive of a new evil which may easily come from the mixing of race, unquote. The Philadelphia Telegraph concludes, quote, "We are here face to face with a condition more perilous to this country than any coming yellow peril or race peril of any color whatsoever. The color peril is right at our doors. It comes from the South, not the Far East. It is not yellow, but black," unquote. Johnson's provocation here, you see them taking it up, exposes reviewers' limited ability to read this work and it sort of exposes the criteria of how they're reading this work, underscoring the critical issue of how we approach narrative, particularly the problem of distinguishing and categorizing narrative as either fact or fiction. And I'll repeat my assertion here. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man is best understood as a human document that engages multiple registers of nonfiction, right? And as I am asserting here the necessary role of literary study in the contemporary world, I'd like to invoke just briefly the contemporary essayist and novelist Teju Cole. His Known and Strange Things of 2016 collection of essays contains an illuminating dialogue on writing and facticity with the author Alexander Hemon, who some of you might know, The Lazarus Project, Nowhere Man, and most recently, Book of My Life. The two authors choose to have a dialogue with one another and have that dialogue represent the coherence of the essay. And the dialogue that they're having is over the matter of fact and fiction and what those divides disable in the way that we approach narrative. So they write to each other on the subject, the essay forming coherence through the in-between spaces of individual perception and morality, and the formation of community through a narrative in which its readers and writers recognize one another. They suggest that through the act of writing, we come to know not only ourselves, but others. As Hemon observes in their dialogue, the insistent distinction between fiction and nonfiction implies that nonfiction is all the stuff outside of fiction or the other way around. Moreover, it marks a text in terms of its relationship to truth, quote unquote, a category that appears to be self-evident and therefore stable, but narration cannot contain stable truth. The truth of narration unfolds through and between narrator and reader, and in different ways. Hemon concludes, narration is creation of truth, which is to say that truth does not precede it. Teju Cole agrees with this. It's the least illuminating thing we could ask about their works, he writes. Moreover, there's spatial and temporal significance to narrative as a practice. It facilitates, according to Hemon, an organic connection with the past. The knowledge of history has to be shared in language. Therefore, the process of presenting even a realist-seeming mode, as Ex-Colored Man does in the writing of his narrative, in fact challenges the representational modes available to African-American writing. And you might speculate, 1912 as well as 2017. We can get into that later. In asserting its very realness, it tests the boundaries of fiction. In testing those boundaries, it challenges its readers to acknowledge the gaps and contradictions of the text's claims to truth. In this challenge to readers, the narrative confronts the way in which history and subjectivity are engaged, whether there is a national collective, individual responses, and/or new spaces of being. Cole and Hemon present a different emphasis of reading. Therefore, narratives are larger than themselves. They're not contained in the way that we think of, these static categories of of truth, of nonfiction, of fiction. And while they may articulate control, they also may create more expansive spaces of knowledge and understanding. What is the relationship of our textual and living selves? What can one share in between? So I think that this dialogue offers a key to reading the autobiography of an ex-colored man. A human document is what it is, a story of ourselves through an individual's encounters with a series of developing cultural and moral objects. We have extended Johnson's evolving relationship to his work by our continued rereading of it. As a human document, the autobiography of an ex-colored man had no value until the reader encountered it. The document represents something from before our own time, asks us what had been. These facts have value through memory, not so much the ex-colored man's, but the space of the reader's encounter where the reader herself or himself hovers between awareness of being and loss of being. I'm going to shift again. In his autobiography, Along This Way, Johnson refers to collateral knowledge, that is the phrase he uses, as a driving concept that links cultural and historical contexts in literary texts. Johnson's West Indian cobbler, who serves as his teacher for a brief time when he's away from Atlanta University, possesses, in Johnson's estimation, a considerable store of collateral knowledge that stirred my curiosity and interest in what I studied. This collateral information not only made it interesting, but gave it a sense and connected it up with life. Johnson's orientation to his studies and to the world was critically altered by his time spent with this man, a man whose name was now forgotten and who disappeared from Jacksonville within the year. The only other teacher who made a subject as interesting to me as did this little cobbler was Brander Matthews at Columbia. I wondered just what it was that kept him down on a cobbler's bench, Johnson asks rhetorically. Like his many successors in the endeavor for nonviolent resistance to oppression, Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, among others, Johnson trained as a lawyer and expansively directed this expertise to the larger endeavor of human understanding. Through writing, scholarship, and activism, Johnson devoted his life to providing an understanding of race and expounding on the meaning and promise of America. In almost all areas of his layered career, he strove to confront the Janus-faced origins of the United States on the issue of freedom and slavery. In the process, he troubled the mythic claims of liberty associated with America, quote unquote, bidding the ancestral bards of African American experiences to speak and be heard. Through these endeavors, he insisted on addressing the past and present of racial oppression and on changing public policy not only through law, but also through sociocultural outlook. Reaching for that future as yet ungraspable, in which African American culture and citizenship could be fully realized, Johnson directed the nation's focus to its history of slavery and racial oppression in order to imagine and realize a better future for all. He devoted his life to this future. Such a future nation would be composed of world citizens, quote unquote, cosmopolites. While the concept of cosmopolitanism has not been fulfilled in its quest for universal understanding and human mutuality, and has been effectively associated with imperialism, nationalism, and parochialism, it persists as a usable, if shifting, measure of academic and real-world relations. Johnson's distinct use of the term in his writings referenced not its widely held negative association with the contradictory claims of world citizenship and world imperialism, but its usefulness as a concept of intercultural understanding and tolerance. This collaborative framework operated for Johnson through the productive tension between the nation and national belonging, to which he remained committed, and transnational cultural identifications created by the conditions of modernity. African Americans of necessity possessed this greater awareness. The Black Atlantic framing modern life for African peoples through the transatlantic slave trade was immediately and forcibly recognizable to its descendants as part of their collateral knowledge. As Paul Gilroy points out, this diasporic condition created a countercultural modernity in which thinkers like Du Bois and Johnson could productively challenge the politically oppressive framework of the nation, even while remaining committed to it. The violent modernity that made the Black Atlantic became, in the writings of Johnson, an innovative concept that enabled transnational movement and affiliation of raced and colonized peoples beyond limiting nationally bounded discourses of identity and homeland. In this search for greater freedom and its attendant justice, other people might join African Americans and share a heightened sense of affiliation and identification. As my co-author, Amritjit Singh observes, the autobiography stands in solidarity with a few works of African-American fiction from the first half of the 20th century, such as Nella Larson's Quicksand in Passing of 28 and 29, Jessie Fawcett's comedy American Style and Plum Bun of 29, George Schuyler's Black No More of 1931, and Chester Himes's The Third Generation of 54. That have brought a sharp perspective on the social disease of colorism that emanates from facing the daily burden of the dwarfing, warping, distorting influence which operates on each and every colored man in the United States. That's a quotation from Ex-Colored Man. At the same time, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's nomenclature of colored people instead of Negroes signals an early recognition of inclusiveness that has now begun to embrace all those who are dispossessed and marginalized. As texts such as Du Bois's Dark Princess of 28 and The World in Africa of 47, Richard Wright's Black Power of 55 and The Color Curtain of 1956, Ian Haney Lopez's White by Law of 96, Matthew Fry Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color of 98, and many other texts demonstrate race in theory and practice is both capacious and contextual, going well beyond the black-white binary in the US. Not simply the cosmopolitanism of individuals, but also the nature of our lives indicates our international interconnectedness. As Supreme Court justices debate just currently the place of other nations' laws in America's consideration of fairness and legitimacy, their very conversations make apparent the American nation's best and worst dispositions in the search for social justice. Global interconnectedness makes obvious our obligation to each other, while also revealing the inequity of new systems of slavery, capitalism, and power. Cosmopolitanism's early 20th century moment of globalization and imperialist crisis resounds in our 21st century moment. The recent nativist and xenophobic turn of the 2015-16 national debates has turned on its head the powerful anti-nativist timber of Du Bois's Of Our Spiritual Strivings and Randolph Bourne's Transnational America. The loud anti-immigrant sentiments of 2016 appear to echo Theodore Roosevelt's claim in 1904 that we cannot have too much immigration of the right kind, and we should have none at all of the wrong kind. The need is to devise some system by which undesirable immigrants shall be kept out entirely, while desirable immigrants are properly distributed throughout the country. Discussion of U.S. citizenship simultaneously entails, however, acknowledgement of U.S. imperialism, as Johnson knew. Both his editorial Why Latin America Dislikes the U.S. of 1913 and his Style of Business Correspondence, that's an unpublished manuscript that Johnson sent in triplicate to the State Department at the start of his diplomatic post to Nicaragua, demonstrate Johnson's awareness of these interdependent concerns. Contemporary debates on immigration, combined with continuing concerns about the citizenship rights of African Americans within the Republic, demonstrate a nativist exclusionary privilege of white citizenship and its racial order that have both national and global implications. There is reluctance to confront white privilege at home or to acknowledge the economic exploitation of other, often non-white nations that undergirds globalization and neoliberal capitalism. As a diplomat and public intellectual, Johnson was involved with several of the events that founded this order in the 20th century. The Platt Amendment permitting U.S. intervention in Cuba and establishing a U.S. naval base there, Guantanamo, 1901, approved 1903. Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of 1904, as well as the Venezuelan crisis of 1902-3 that prompted it. And the post-crisis situation into Johnson was introduced as a U.S. diplomat to that nation in 1906-9. In hindsight, it is obvious that the Monroe Doctrine protected American imperial interests in the hemisphere, particularly but not limited to Latin America. Roosevelt's corollary took the protectionist doctrine a step further, using it to justify American intervention in and annexation of those nations. The Platt Amendment, which removed U.S. occupation of Cuba, also ensured a continued American presence through its naval base there, and by justifying U.S. intervention when needed to defend Cuban sovereignty, quote unquote. American intervention was often couched in terms of business and financial obligations, as was the case in Haiti. U.S. occupation of that nation stretched from 1914 to 1934. Johnson would have recognized in this 21st century discourse of immigration and citizenship rights the perpetual us versus them, which is defined not simply by war, but by the American imperialist agenda imposed on French and Spanish-speaking as well as African-descended peoples of the hemispheres of America. No doubt he would also have recognized in the 20th century segregationist practices imposed on American citizens of Mexican descent their similarity to African American oppression. Today's waves of Mexican American migration and immigration not only help sharpen recall of Native American genocide, but also illuminate African American experiences of displacement and second-class citizenship, which has included systemic practices that define contingent labor forces and contingent citizenship here. And here I'm thinking of Japanese internment. Contingent citizenship is another paradox, like X-colored. The landscapes of memory, spectral and symbolic in Johnson's 1912 novel, continue to mark national attitudes towards the past and present of this nation, which is decisively defined by slavery and continued forms of oppression. Discursively engaged with the myth and reality of America and with the brutal logic of terror enacted on raced subjects, be they Haitian, Mexican, Native American, or African American, Johnson would have recognized the recently documented examples of police brutality and terror from Ohio, South Carolina, New York, and Texas, to name a few. The high stakes that have been placed on romanticizing the past of slavery have enabled the imposition of continued acts of terror on slavery's survivors. At the time of this writing, Charlottesville had not happened, but it's yet another example. The Reverend William Barber talks about it's not simply a matter of statues, it's a matter of statutes, right? That the statues are emerging in the death of Reconstruction moment to mark a certain white supremacist reign. The slaying of 9 African-American churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015 was both an act of white supremacy and an attempt to control the history of slavery, and I can say more about that later if you'd like me to. To discuss the promise of the United States, Johnson argued it is also necessary to address its betrayals of that promise to the peoples within its gates, peoples whose lives provide evidence of the nation's shameful, oppressive practices. Only through such acknowledgement can the nation reach its ideal, better future, altered by the recognition and inclusion of its peoples. There are similar notes in the fictional writings of Johnson's contemporaries, such as Abraham Cahan, Mary Anton, and Anzia Yezierska. And you may also liken in the 21st century moment some of these ideas to Hemon and Cole as well. Has the permanent wave Johnson anticipated found contemporary expression? The Reverend Joseph Lowery explicitly linked Johnson and President Barack Obama in his inaugural benediction of 2009, where he invoked Johnson's "Lift Every Voice and Sing." Familiarly known as the Black National Anthem to African Americans, this song actually presented the imperative that every voice sing of the Black trials to citizenship and spiritual fellowship in America. The web of references, influences, and legacies between Johnson, Obama, and Lowery himself as a civil rights leader is indicative of the diversity in motion of a continued, distinctly national conversation about understanding, equality, and Black value. Yet our 21st century media's preoccupation with the candidacy and election of Barack Obama as, quote, the first Black president, unquote, demonstrates America's continued obsession with racial categories and their ownership, as well as with the nation's reluctance to share voice and power with its minority citizens. The focus on Barack Obama's ability to inhabit the status of Black and president illustrates how the very categories by which the nation measures progress towards liberation often become entangled with the constraining, limited categories it seeks to transcend. There is no futurity for African Americans in these measurements. Time stops in conversations about Blackness, legitimacy, and ownership. There can never be successive Black presidents to propel this conversation to the future through the expansion of thought represented by diverse individuals and more complex modes of social connection, such as affiliation. Literature, in order to succeed, must bear a relation to the real world, even if that bond is forged through a relation that doesn't yet exist. Literary study is a necessary act that affirms this human connection. Johnson recognized the importance of university study, especially the disciplines of history, literature, drama, art, and education. He was acutely aware of his role as an African-American educator, humanist, and cosmopolite at Columbia's and New York University's teachers' colleges. The very scene of those classrooms could cultivate the moral imagination of individuals in conversation with each other. As one assesses the meaning and value of education in the digital age, we ought to recall Johnson's description of his 1912 narrative as a human document, a complex work, excuse me, contemplating human thoughts, actions, and works of art. To place the ex-colored man in the 21st century classroom is to recognize the urgency of freeing knowledge from a perceived uniformity and facticity through what it is that narrative provides, human contact, and a commitment to multiple discrepant engagements, in the words of Nathaniel Mackey, collateral knowledge, in the words of James Weldon Johnson, and to the family bookshelf of African American literature, in the words of my mentor, Robert Steptoe. Studying Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man Today affirms the crucial nature of such literary readings. Personal and ancestral literary readings open consciousness and enable shared intellectual, cultural, and racial expansion. The archive, Johnson knew, has a life of its own. Its liveliness points to New Perspectives on James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, my new edition of essays, collected and published nearly 100 years after this work's initial publication. The essays in this collection offer a wide range of perspectives on the autobiography of an ex-colored man and its creator. They are reevaluations of Johnson's work, and they acknowledge the power of the autobiography and its literary interpretations in the 21st century. The record of Black cultural expression has expanded in the 100 years since its publication, but the promise of a more attentive and attuned nation has yet to be fulfilled. This we know all too well. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man's retrospective framework of seeming regret. I cannot suppress the thought that I have sold my birthright for a mess of pottage, the shadowy recollection of his origins in slavery and Reconstruction, leaves Johnson's readers poised on the edge of a new modern reality. The autobiography provides a forward glance, to use another one of Johnson's phrases, by emphasizing the futurity of African Americans and the nation through reading. The autobiography creates the possibility of this future discursive space through the sharing of human documents that think through art and human processes to create a shared moral imagination. It's narrative, not fact or fiction, that performs this work, and it has a significant impact on the ability of readers and writers to imagine and place themselves in the future. This reality asserts not one self-sustaining narrative, but multiple dynamic and continuous narratives. Excuse me. Teju Cole says that he expects the rewards of literary production will inevitably include people whose work is embedded inside newer technologies like Twitter. Yet, as Alexander Hemon writes, if we cannot continue our individual humanity in the collective project of humanity, if we cannot imagine a world better than this, and not by means of some spiritual opiate, this world is over. In that case, literature, which is always sent to some reader in the future, will have to renegotiate its modes of participation in human experience. If we ever find ourselves writing for the present, which would essentially mean that tweeting is all we can do, I would feel absolutely defeated as a human being and a writer. As narrative technologies change, narrative itself should vigilantly defend and advance the collective project of humanity, reaching for that future and to future readers. The collaborative and community-minded James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference here at Emory creates the space for this collective project of humanity and continues Johnson's approach in The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, where he interrogates categories of knowledge and the shifting, complex meaning of race and difference in this nation and beyond. Holding Johnson's book, one holds not simply a time capsule of 1912, but a document that represents Johnson's sharing of a living tradition of ethical reflection and interrogation, one that demands renewed attention in our 21st century. You will find many such interpretations in my New Perspectives book. Lawrence Oliver's essay demonstrates the space Johnson made for revision to the cosmopolitan model of citizenship and literary criticism espoused by his mentor, Brander Matthews, while Daphne Lamoth draws connections between Johnson's novel of self-reflexive ethnographic translation of African-American modernity with Teju Cole's 21st century exploration of global affiliations and continued displacement in Open City, underscoring the centrality of writing to forging the bonds of connection in the story of migration, immigration, and identification. As Diana Paulin traces the origin of the pseudoscientific and inherently negative term miscegenation to nationhood discourses emerging after the Civil War, she demonstrates how the transnational racial romances of Pauline Hopkins and Johnson trouble this utterly fictitious and controlling black-white divide. Bruce Barnhart examines the economies of racial difference and subjectivity as they persist from Johnson's time to our own. And he's focused really on economic precarity and the notion of how African American subjects can find themselves in time. As cosmopolitanism engages ideas of origin and promise, so it also must engage notions of authenticity and audience or community. Ben Glaser points to Johnson's use of rhythm and a rhythmic mode of exegesis to frame black identity and collectivity, his satire referencing a heterogeneous modern audience. Frederick Karam addresses the question of authenticity framed by Johnson for his contemporary readership, while Laurie Brooks charts the cultural significance of ragtime and the quote-unquote professor as either agents of a cultural authenticity or transgressors of established categories of culture and authority. And she's particularly concerned with music unions and control of ragtime through music unions. My essay examines Johnson's work as a repository of knowledge that challenges the very idea of the static archive. Such studies direct us to consider the status of Johnson's text as quote-unquote classic, right? This is a term out there. While Michael Nolan is concerned by the indexical value assigned to the autobiography, a value which problematically considers not simply the text, but what it anticipated in a literarily richer future for African American literature beyond Jim Crow segregation. Robert Steptoe reads the autobiography in conversation with Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father to suggest that Johnson's work is now made a classic by the ways in which it is refreshed by Obama's narrative in our continued reading and reassessment of African American literature. We continue to read the autobiography of an ex-colored man because of its engagement with modernity, internationalism, citizenship, not only of the narrator's new 20th century, but also our own. It anticipated the troubling relations among art, capitalism, and labor, as well as the history and historiography of race peoples in the New World. The series of paradoxes that Johnson's novel examines crucially inform 21st century readers' dynamic understanding of America as a nation. Johnson's work imagines a nationless cosmopolitanism that nevertheless espouses American culture's distinctiveness through its black folk art forms, presents the American South as the ground of the new colonial enterprise of industrial labor, and ambivalently describes how black art forms become commodified. The term ex-colored only begins the inquiry into the contradictions of being an American and a Negro, as Du Bois described it in 1903. The 2008 election of Barack Obama as president, heralded as bringing forth a quote-unquote post-racial society, has proven something quite the opposite, true to the phrase's internal paradox, a culture continually obsessed with racial difference. Reading the autobiography of an ex-colored man now, we might consider how crucial our current endeavors to interpret issues of human existence in the digital age, what is available and how, and what it means about us, quote unquote. The new tools, whether the recognition of an ethnic archive, the interrogation of a literary classic, or a more expansive theorization of knowledge practices, do not replace the older concepts of knowledge, but instead make them relevant and more widely acknowledged. Interpreters must integrate their encounters with other individuals, ideas, and cultures, absorb, copy, and make intimate the random knowledges offered by the archive. To be transformed is also to transform our understanding of humanity, to be explained as well as to interpret ourselves to each other. These interpretative and biographical processes help reveal the ways in which literature and literary study shape our experiences and articulate our transformations in the modern world. They do so through a narrative that is the creation of truth. As the inheritors of Johnson's beautiful and provocative work, let us imagine and produce the still unwritten chapters of this ongoing narrative.